Once upon a time, for whatever reason, three men came face to face on a plane. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Each of them has a gun in his waistband. It looks like they will soon use these weapons against each other. At this point, it doesn't matter which one is good, which one is bad, or which one is ugly. There is only one important question. Who is going to kill who? Let's take a quick look at the dynamics in the equation. If three people are pointing guns at each other at the same time and each has the potential to shoot the other two, then there are 3 factorial probabilities for 3 simultaneous shootings. So, according to this simple formula, there can be 6 different possible sequences of hits in a moment when 3 people are pointing guns at each other at the same time. In the real world, however, this situation is very rare and often very difficult to resolve. That's why such situations are more the subject of fictional scenarios. So what happened here has a name and a definition: the Mexican Standoff. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Mexican Standoff and its use in cinema. Have a good time. Even those who have never seen a Western are familiar with this iconic scene. There is a cache of Confederate gold hidden in the desert, and Blondie, Angel Eyes, and Tuco want to get their hands on the treasure. All 3 men find themselves in the cemetery where the treasure is buried, and a confrontation becomes inevitable. Set to Ennio Morricone's iconic score, we watch a high-stakes Mexican standoff. Both Blondie and Angel Eyes try to take control of the situation, and the name on the tombstone where the loot is buried is inscribed on a rock and placed in the center of the cemetery. Without a word, the 3 steel-eyed men take their places and look at each other, waiting to see who will make the first move. As the audience's anxiety reaches its peak, Blondie shoots her black-clad foe, only to discover that Tuco's gun is not even loaded. The good, the bad, and the ugly is not the first example of the Mexican dilemma, but it is the movie that introduced this famous trope to the movies, and it is a masterpiece. The tension explodes like gunpowder as Blondie shoots Angel Eyes. It is this tension and the resulting explosion that led to the so-called Mexican Standoff. The Mexican Standoff is a conflict in which there is no strategy to ensure victory for any side. Anyone who initiates aggression can trigger their own end. At the same time, the parties cannot extricate themselves from the situation without negotiating a ceasefire or suffering a loss, and the strategic tension will continue to build until one of these 3 potential organic outcomes occurs or an external force intervenes. The term Mexican standoff was first used in the context of the use of firearms and still commonly refers to a situation in which the parties face some kind of threat from each other. Standoffs range from someone holding a cell phone and threatening to call the police, to being controlled by a blackmailer, to global conflicts and even the economy. The Mexican standoff is also a term used to refer to a situation that arises in the global economy. In this situation, a country's current account deficit and debts become so large that it has to borrow more to pay them off. This creates a vicious circle because new debt is used to pay off existing debt, which creates more problems in the long run. The Mexican standoff as an armed impasse is a recurring cinematic trope. When we look at the etymological origin of this concept, sources claim that the reference is to the Mexican-American War, or post-war Mexican bandits in the 19th century. The earliest known use of the phrase in print is the following line from a short story about Mexico on March 19, 1876. "Go," he said sternly. "We'll call it a Mexican skirmish. You lose your money but save your life." In Blazing Saddles, Mel Brooks, playing the corrupt leader of a town, explains to the new sheriff, "In this town we have a very effective law against riding dirty horseback through the streets, but if you shoot him in self-defense, it's okay." This scene is another example of what is known as the Mexican standoff, a situation so dangerous that no one wants to be the first to act. The term was coined by American newspaper columnist Walter Lippmann in the 1920s and refers to the long-standing agreement between Mexico and the United States not to enter each other's territory. The agreement became even more important after World War I because Mexican revolutionaries threatened to cut off US oil supplies. The standoff also became a slogan for diplomatic pressure, with countries threatening war unless another country agreed to do something or otherwise back down. The use of force was not necessary because both sides faced equal risk if war broke out. There is an oft-quoted saying attributed to General von Clausewitz in World War I, "All diplomacy is the continuation of war by other means." In popular culture, the term Mexican standoff refers to conflicts where neither side has a measurable advantage. Historically, commentators have used the term to refer to the Soviet Union-United States nuclear conflict during the Cold War. particularly the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The key element that makes such situations Mexican standoffs is the perceived equality of power between the parties involved. The inability of any party to advance its position safely is common to all standoffs, but the Mexican standoff has an additional disadvantage. Neither side has a safe way to withdraw from its position, so the standoff becomes de facto permanent. The cliché of the Mexican standoff, in which each side threatens the other with a gun, is now recognized as a movie trope due to its frequent use as a plot device in cinema. Great directors such as John Woo and Quentin Tarantino have also made extensive use of the Mexican standoff in their films. Although it has been copied, recreated, and parodied countless times since 1966, the conflict in the good, the bad, and the ugly has yet to be overcome. It was a bold way to end a film that began a larger influence on spaghetti westerns that would attract a new generation of filmmakers. Creators like Quentin Tarantino and Vince Gilligan often cite Leone's influence on their work. The Mexican standoff has long been a trope of cinema, but none more iconic than this iconic spaghetti western. Set in the middle of a rundown cemetery, director Sergio Leone makes it clear that each of these men is surrounded by death, both behind them and potentially in front of them. In the midst of the chaos of the Civil War, these three men, world-weary and resigned to life, have found their way to this cemetery and the inevitable triple confrontation. Throughout the movie, Blondie, Angel Eyes, and Tuco had complicated relationships, full of betrayals and uneasy alliances. So any trust that might have led them to make a deal to divide the gold had been completely shattered. This is the showdown that inevitably builds. The Mexican standoff is used so much in movies because it is a great storytelling device. The Mexican standoff was first used by American screenwriter Ben Hecht when he wrote the screenplay for the 1937 film A Star is Born, in which three gunmen find themselves in a Mexican shootout. The term was later popularized by its use in the 1953 Western film High Noon. There is a big difference between two people facing each other and more than two people facing each other. This is an important distinction in the Mexican standoff, because in the case of two people, it is more of a duel than a standoff, and the outcome depends very much on the skill of the people standing opposite each other. But in the scenes of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the many adaptations of the Mexican standoff that follow, there is a second situation. This is known as the triangle dilemma, or the triple dilemma. Now think of it this way. In a scenario where two people are pointing guns at each other, the situation is actually relatively simple. Either one of them will shoot, or they will both back down. Now, this is important, because it is possible for two people to stop killing each other. But when we introduce a third person into the equation, it is no longer so simple. In scenarios with three or more people, the tension created by the Mexican standoff increases dramatically, and the situation is much more irreversible than when two people face each other. This is because the third person makes it very difficult for them to make the relatively simple decisions that are possible for two people to make. Let me explain it simply. We have three characters, A, B, and C. Normally, if characters A and B were facing each other, maybe they would look into each other's eyes and both of them would be convinced that the other one is not going to pull the trigger, and they would slowly lower their guns. But when we include character C, this is not possible because even if character A and character B think about it, it is very difficult for them to predict what character C will do at the same time, because none of them are allies in this equation. They are all singularly each other's enemies, so character C can target character A as well as character B. Just like in chess, the opening moves are simple, but the next move increases the possibilities tremendously. Therefore, even though the third person we add to the equation is only an addition of one person, it increases the possibilities greatly, making it more difficult to solve. Even if character C is someone who will never shoot, his mere presence increases the probabilities of behavior of characters A and B to horrible levels. In their situation, each person can harm the other, while being harmed themselves at the same time. This is a difficult situation to navigate. In social contract theory, such situations represent a notion of balance of power or equilibrium that creates tension between the parties. One person's action may depend on the reaction of others, as each has the potential to harm the others. Without a redemptive act or external intervention, this situation is a kind of cyclical conflict and can freeze the status quo. Philosophically, this situation involves issues of ethics, balance of power, will, and conflict resolution. Such situations push philosophical thinking to address important issues related to complex decisions and human interactions. Tarantino has frequently used the idea of the Mexican standoff throughout his career. Reservoir Dogs, True Romance, Pulp Fiction, and Inglourious Basterds all feature a Mexican standoff somewhere in the script. A Mexican standoff usually involves three parties. Opponent A can shoot his opponent B. However, while opponent A is busy doing this, opponent C can shoot opponent A and thus win the conflict. I described how this is iconically done in one of Tarantino's favorite films, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Although Tarantino uses this Mexican conflict concept quite often, it never ends the same way. The tension is always great and the audience has plenty of time to get anxious and start guessing what will happen next. In Pulp Fiction, the Mexican standoff takes place between Jules, Pumpkin, and his wife Honey Bunny. Later, in this tense scene, the standoff is compounded when Vincent returns from the restroom and points a gun at Honey Bunny. At the end of the standoff, Jules, played by Sam Jackson, allows Honey Bunny and Pumpkin to take the money and leave because all she cares about is the mysterious suitcase. In Reservoir Dogs, the opposite happens. There is a bit of dramatic irony because the audience knows that Mr. Orange is a cop, but Mr. White still defends him because he still believes he is good. So Joe points a gun at Mr. Orange because he knows he's a cop, Mr. White points a gun at Joe to defend Mr. Orange, and Joe's son points a gun at Mr. White. Everyone with a gun shoots and they all die or are mortally wounded, as in a chain reaction. Theoretically, Joe's son Eddie should have been alive at the end of the shootout, but since Mr. White was able to shoot twice and kill Eddie, he died too. Tarantino's legendary dilemmas can be discussed at length, so I won't go into them all in this video. Maybe I will discuss Tarantino's cinema separately in the future. Although the Mexican Standoff is a plot in the Western movie genre where a group of people are in a standoff where each of them points his gun at the others and no one is willing to back down, there are many variations on this basic setup. For example, there could be a hostage. The hostage can be used as a human shield or targeted by people who care about him. The conflict can be between a character and an entire community, such as a whole town or village. The parties involved may be unequal. For example, one party may have an overwhelming advantage in numbers or firepower. There may be deception. For example, one side may believe that the other side has been disarmed, while the second side still has its weapon hidden. One side may have an undiscovered or concealed weapon. For example, the hidden weapon under the table in the movie Hateful Eight, which the audience knew about for a long time. Look, for example, a scene from the movie Transformers: Dark of the Moon. Although the sequels of the Transformers series are quite low-quality works in my opinion, this scene is a very good scene. Because as I said, when the Mexican dilemma is applied correctly, it significantly affects storytelling. In this scene, Ironhide collides with two Decepticons, and after that iconic transformation scene, they enter a Mexican standoff. Ironhide is 2-on-1 at first, but then another Autobot gets involved and they become 2-on-2. Now, as we said, in Mexican standoffs there are usually no apparent advantages or disadvantages. Here the two Decepticons and the two Autobots seem to have an equal advantage in terms of distance, position, and visibility. So Ironhide offers to lay down their weapons, and they all lay down their weapons at the same time. But the second hidden weapon I just mentioned comes into play, and one of the Decepticons pulls out a hidden weapon from his back and attacks Ironhide. The Autobots successfully react to this attack and defeat the Decepticons. Since we are talking about characters who will not die with a single bullet like humans, the dynamics of the Mexican standoff were stretched to the extremes and a beautiful scene emerged. Let me give you an example from another movie, The Matrix Revolutions. You know, this scene is a great scene. The scene where Morpheus, Seraph, and Trinity enter Merovingian's place with weapons. Here Merovingian promises that all three of them can get out safely if they put down their weapons and come to Merovingian. Since Neo is a prisoner in Merovingian's hands at the time, they first try to make a deal. But Merovingian rightly says, for there to be a deal, you have to give me something. When they ask what he wants, Merovingian says the eyes of the seer. So he wants something that is not going to happen. Now, I said there are various variations in standoffs, but the situation here is a bit more complicated. Because our guys don't have guns, but the Merovingian's men who surround them have tons of guns. When Trinity realizes that the Merovingian doesn't really want to make a deal, he's just kidding around. She says, I don't have time to deal with this bullshit, and explodes the tension that has already escalated with the music. The use of music in Mexican standoffs is very important, by the way. I can't play these scenes now because Warner Brothers is copywriting them, but when you watch this scene again, you will understand what I mean. As Trinity launches the first attack, Seraph and Morpheus attack those around them at the same time. What we said, in the cliché Mexican standoff scenes, usually the events take place in a large area with few people, but here it takes place in a very narrow area with too many people. It's really hard to shoot scenes like this, it's a lot of work. These are possible only after drawing storyboards one by one and long choreography work. At one point in the scene, when Seraph kicks a pistol into the air, Trinity locks onto that pistol, grabs it, and puts it directly on Merovingian's head. Almost simultaneously, everyone is pointing guns at each other again. They're back to where they were, but with one important difference: now our guys have guns. But as we said, usually in a standoff, nobody has a clear advantage or disadvantage. But in this scene, our guys have a big disadvantage, because the other side is outnumbered. Secondly, in a stalemate, there is no way to get out of the situation unscathed. In fact, Trinity says to Merovingian, "If you don't give Neo, we all die right now, right here." Now, different methods are used to overcome the clichés of the Mexican standoff. In this particular scene, this method is that Trinity is directly targeting the Merovingian, the most important person there. So the disadvantages of numbers are balanced in this way. So it's quality over quantity. While everyone is up on the hill waiting to see what will happen in case of tension, Merovingian finally has to make a deal and gives Neo to them. Let's remember what a deal was, one of the 3 organic outcomes of the Mexican standoff. Successful directors develop and transform these variations and apply them successfully to their works. Raising and lowering the tension at the right time is one of the most important details that make a movie good or bad. That's why Mexican dilemmas are very important for cinema, and when they are applied well, as in the examples I gave, they are delicious. See you in my next video. Take care of yourself. Goodbye.